Right now in Sudan, more than 150,000 people are dead. Over 14 million have fled their homes. Mothers, children, entire families forced to live in camps or across the borders. Entire towns have been burned down to the ground. And also researchers from Yale University studying satellite images say that they have seen evidence of mass executions, villages wiped out, and even bloodstains visible from space. The war between the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces (RSF) has turned into the world's worst humanitarian crisis. But outside Sudan, the world has largely gone silent. So the question is, how did it get this bad? Why did two men, once hailed as heroes of revolution, turn their guns on each other and on their own people? To understand what this is all about, I want us to go back to where all this began. And I'm going to request you guys please to stay with me on this one so that we can move together to understand the real origin of this catastrophe. So let's go back to December 19th, 2018, when a revolution broke out after decades of poverty, oppression, and corruption. The Sudanese people had finally had enough. They wanted change. So they wanted freedom. They wanted democracy. And within months, two men rose to the center of that revolution. Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemeti. Together, they did the unthinkable. They toppled President Omar al-Bashir, a man who had ruled Sudan with an iron fist since 1989. The streets of Khartoum erupted in joy. People believed this was the beginning of a new era, unfortunately for them. A Sudan without fear. A Sudan built on democracy. But years later, those same two men are now at war, and their fight has brought the country to its knees. So the question is, what went wrong? To understand Sudan's present, you have to understand the past. This wasn't the first time soldiers had seized power. In fact, almost every Sudanese leader has been overthrown by the military. The first coup happened in 1958 when Abdel Khalil, who was both prime minister and a retired military officer, overthrew his own government. Can you imagine that? And then, in 1969, Kanogafa Nimeri led a coup, ending a short-lived democracy. He ruled until 1985 when General Abdel Rahman ousted him and restored civilian rule under Sadiq Mahid. But that didn't last for long. In 1989, Colonel Omar al-Bashir took power through yet another coup and became Sudan's new ruler. Now, coming to power, Bashir knew Sudan's history of coups too well, and he didn't want to be the next to be overthrown. So he came up with a tactic called coup-proofing, whereby he surrounded himself with multiple armed groups that would keep each other in check, meaning there would be none of them that would be strong enough to remove him. So they kept themselves in check. In other words, they kept telling on themselves. So he built ties with the Sudanese Armed Forces, that is the SAF, using them to crush in a rebellion. Especially while he was in power, there was a rebellion that erupted in the southern part of Sudan, upon which he decided to send the SFA there. But meanwhile, while that conflict was actually happening in the southern part of Sudan, another conflict erupted in the western part of Sudan, which was Darfur. As a result of poor infrastructure, little political representation of people in the western part of Sudan, and barely, they had little or no access to healthcare. So they decided to rebel. And then in 2013, rebel groups attacked government troops in al-Fashar. And instead of Bashir relying heavily on his army, he decided to use the local militia that were at the time commonly known as the Janjaweed, and he sent them there to wipe the rebellion. What he did was he armed them and gave them all the military equipment they needed. The result was horrific. Villages were burnt, mass killings happened, rape, and millions were displaced. And among these Janjaweed fighters, one man stood out actually for Bashir. That man was called Hemeti. Bashir admired his loyalty and brutality, giving him the nickname Hemeti, which means my protector. That was the moniker he gave the guy. After recognizing Hemeti and giving him the nickname, this is where we begin to witness the rise of the RSF. Now, by 2010, the civil war in Darfur had ended, but Bashir's power had weakened. And Bashir's power had weakened because at the time, South Sudan had gained independence, taking with it most of the country's oil-rich resources. And because of that, the economy crumbled. So Bashir made a strategic move in 2013, where he officially recognized Hemeti's fighters as a paramilitary force called the Rapid Support Forces, called in short RSF. RSF. Why am I struggling with that title? RSF. And that move placed them under Sudan's intelligence agency. So look at Sudan's intelligence agency more like the SFC in Uganda. So more like the SFC in Uganda that has the best interests of President Museveni. You understand? So later in 2017, Bashir made it law, putting Hemeti directly under his command and giving him control over some of Darfur's gold mines. So by making this move, what Bashir was making sure was that despite the fact that he trusted Hemeti so much, he wanted to make sure that Hemeti was under him and reminding him that he was the guy that had the power. So after Hemeti was given the mines, he was even allowed to send fighters abroad, for example, to Yemen or Libya in exchange for money. So later on, the RSF became extremely loyal to Hemeti alone, as they also became richer. And that was actually a very dangerous thing for Bashir, because a small group of people was becoming loyal to one entity, which means without Hemeti's order, even if the president gave an order at the time, due to this loyalty, there was no way they were going to listen to him. And later on, we will learn that it actually worked not in the favor of al-Bashir. So while Bashir was busy empowering his protectors, ordinary citizens continued to suffer. Inflation soared, food prices doubled, and people had no jobs. So by 2018, people reached their boiling point, which now takes us to a point where we examine and look at how Bashir came to fall. So the struggles continued. Protests swept through Sudan's streets. People chanted freedom, peace, and justice. At first, the army and the RSF cracked down brutally on the people. But after months of unrest, the RSF militia realized later on that Bashir's time was over, so they didn't really need him to be in charge. And therefore, on April 11, 2019, the two forces, SAF and RSF, turned on Bashir and removed him from power. So the protesters at this point celebrated, but they were cautious when the protesters were celebrating. They didn't fully trust the men who had taken power that soon. And then soon, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan became the head of state, with Hemeti being his deputy. At first, they promised to hand power over to the civilians, but instead, they turned their guns on the same people who had fought for freedom. And therefore, on June 3rd, 2019, RSF soldiers opened fire on peaceful demonstrators in Khartoum, killing more than 100 people. That situation, demonstrated a fragile democracy and a broken promise that was, given to the people of Sudan after the revolution. And therefore, after pressure mounted from the UK, the United States, and African Union, Sudan's military and civilian leaders agreed to share power in a transitional government. So it sounded hopeful for, in the first instance, on the ground that they had agreed that for 21 months, Sudan will be ruled under the military, and then for 18 months, it will be ruled under the civilian rule. Of course, they had to appoint a civilian leader who happened to be Abdallah Hamdok. He was an economist and he became the prime minister from the civilian side, but the military kept meddling. And after endless interferences, Hamdok decided to resign in January 2022, which I believe, in my opinion, was actually the whole beginning, the genesis of where we are right now. So, when Hamdok resigned, al-Burhan took full control, and Hemeti still remained number 2, though Hemeti was not happy about it. So the two began building separate alliances. Burhan courted leaders in the Middle East, and Europe, while Hemeti used his gold wealth to strengthen his influence in places like the UAE and Russia. By December 2022, international mediators pushed them to sign a new deal. The particulars of the deal were that they promised that a civilian-led government by April 2023 be established, but it all collapsed even before it got started. The question is why? So it was because that deal required that the RSF would be integrated into the national army under Burhan, something that Hemeti refused. So Burhan wanted it done in 2 years, but Hemeti told him no, it will only be done in a period of 10 years, and that disagreement became the trigger of where we are right now in as far as Sudan is concerned. That is when the war began, and it has never ended to this day, 3 years later. So when the war began in April 2023, both men already had guns and armies, ready for war. The SAF controlled the skies, while RSF dominated the ground. As a matter of fact, it's been alleged that the UAE has supplied the RSF with weapons and drones in exchange for Sudanese gold as part of the broader bid to control global gold trade. As we speak right now, the RSF controls most of Darfur, effectively splitting the country into two. Reports have indicated mass killings, ethnic cleansing, and villages being wiped off the map. More than 15,000 people are already dead, and over 14 million people have been displaced. And in reflection, I want to think that Sudan's story feels like a tragic loop, because every time its people rise up for freedom, they are crushed by the same cycle of power, greed, and betrayal. The images that are actually being shared through social media are actually very horrific images that are exhibiting the most human acts being a human being can do to another human being. Actually, researchers have begun to compare this to the that happened years ago, because these people are actually going door to door. Ever since the RSF took over Darfur, they have been going door to door, driving them out of their villages and committing these mass massacres. There's a possibility that now that the country has been split into two, that is a bigger part that is being owned, that is now being taken over by RSF, and then the other part that is being taken up by the SAF. It is presumed that maybe after that, maybe they could have a deal whereby now there is a division of power or sharing of power between the two factions. But again, analysts believe that this is just the beginning of the worst images or the worst occurrences that are coming ahead of us, as the RSF are determined to occupy more space before they could get to a table to talk. Also, Kenya has actually been dragged into this conversation, and I came across a video by Gachagua, and he said that President Ruto was actually doing gold business with Hemeti, despite the fact that these people have actually been declared as international criminals of human rights abuse. He is openly doing business with a man that is a criminal on the run. And just like that, I was watching a video on TikTok of a Kenyan who said that just like that, because of Ruto's association to Hemeti, every Sudanese child will grow up knowing that Kenya took part in enabling. That is to say, every time money exchanges hands between Ruto and the people and Hemeti, it means he is enabling. There are also reports that allege that actually weapons are being, passed through Jomo Kenyatta Airport right into Sudan. I don't know how factual that is, but everything seems to point to the fact that Ruto is an accomplice to the massacres happening in Sudan. Well, whatever it is that is happening, I'm really sending love to our people in Sudan, brothers and sisters, and hoping that you can actually maneuver through this, and we pray that you finally see life at the end of the tunnel. See you guys again.